There was a moment when the Guess Who weren't just another rock band. They were the band everyone feared, admired, and couldn't escape. 14 top 40 hits, a #1 anthem that shook the United States during wartime, and a sound that dominated both sides of the border. But behind the fame was something darker, a quiet fracture that grew into a full-blown war. A war over ownership, identity, betrayal, and the question of who really had the right to call themselves the Guess Who. The Meteoric Rise. Long before they became a battleground for lawyers, egos, and competing versions of themselves, the Guess Who were just a group of teenagers in Winnipeg trying to survive in the bar circuit. Back then, they weren't the Guess Who at all. They were Chad Allen and the Expressions, a local band playing covers to small crowds. But in 1965, everything shifted when they decided to record their take on the British hit Shakin' All Over. No one expected the song to explode the way it did, not even the band, but it swept across Canada and the United States, giving them their first real shot at stardom. The mysterious marketing trick, where their label released the record with the phrase "Guess Who" to spark curiosity, accidentally became their identity. And just like that, the band had a name people remembered even if they didn't know the faces behind it. But the real turning point wasn't a name or a gimmick, it was Burton Cummings, who joined in 1966 with a voice that sounded like it came from a completely different universe. Paired with guitarist Randy Bachman, they formed a creative partnership that changed the band's future forever. Their chemistry turned raw talent into something sharper and more powerful. They weren't just trying to keep up with the British invasion anymore, they were becoming one of the first North American bands to push back against it. Within a few years, the hits came fast. These Eyes, Laughing, Undun, songs that didn't just chart, they defined a moment, blending rock with soul, jazz flourishes, and a vocal intensity no one else had. By the late 60s, the Guess Who weren't just climbing the charts, they were rewriting the rules for what a Canadian band could even accomplish. But fame comes with friction. And inside the band, small cracks were already beginning to form, cracks that would only widen as the spotlight intensified. The peak, when they ruled the charts. By 1970, the Guess Who weren't just rising, they were unstoppable. The same band that once played tiny Winnipeg bars now found themselves in arenas filled with fans who knew every note. Their sound had grown bolder, and so had their confidence. Burton Cummings' voice, smooth one moment, explosive the next, became the band's signature weapon. Randy Bachman's guitar work pushed the music into territory most North American bands hadn't dared to explore yet. Together, they were shaping a sound that didn't belong to Britain or America. It was their own. But nothing defined their peak more than the moment lightning struck. American Woman. The song didn't come from weeks of planning or a polished studio concept. It was born on stage in Ontario when Bachman broke a guitar string. While he fixed it, he started riffing to test the tuning. Cummings walked back on stage, heard the groove, and improvised the now iconic opening line. The crowd reacted instantly. The band realized they'd stumbled onto something that felt raw and electrifying, so they built it into a full song. When American Woman hit the airwaves in 1970, it detonated. It climbed straight to #1 on the US Billboard Hot 100, making the Guess Who the first Canadian band in history to claim the top spot. At a time when the Vietnam War dominated headlines, the song's edgy tone and gritty message felt like a rebellious cry, even if the band insisted it wasn't designed as a political statement. Listeners turned it into one anyway, and it became a symbol of defiance at a moment when America was boiling with unrest. The band suddenly had the world's attention. They were on every major TV show, headlining global tours, and proving that a group from Winnipeg could go toe-to-toe with the biggest acts in rock. But the explosion of fame came with pressure. The non-stop touring, the creative demands, and the expectations built around their biggest hit started rubbing against something more fragile inside the group. The personal differences between Bachman and Cummings. The band was at the top of the world, but the fault lines underneath were getting harder to ignore. And one sudden departure would change everything. Fragmentation begins. For most bands, a #1 single marks the beginning of a new chapter. Bigger tours, bigger budgets, bigger dreams. But for the Guess Who, the aftermath of American Woman exposed the cracks that had been quietly forming for years. While fans saw a group at its absolute peak, backstage the energy was shifting. The long nights, the constant travel, and the weight of being one of the biggest acts in North America were starting to grind everyone down. Randy Bachman, the architect of many of their defining guitar lines, was struggling the most. Years of health issues, including a serious bout of gallbladder complications, forced him to step away from multiple shows. At the same time, his personal life was changing. Bachman had converted to Mormonism and found himself clashing with the band's fast-paced, hard-partying lifestyle. Creative differences between him and Burton Cummings, already simmering, were becoming impossible to ignore. One wanted tighter musicianship and discipline. The other wanted freedom and evolution. Both visions were valid, but they collided like two storms moving toward the same point. In May 1970, just as American Woman dominated the charts, Bachman made the decision that shocked everyone. He walked away. At a moment when the band was arguably the biggest it had ever been, he stepped off the stage and didn't look back. Fans thought it was temporary. It wasn't. The band pivoted quickly, bringing in guitarists Kurt Winter and Greg Lescue, hoping to keep the momentum alive. And to their credit, they did. The Guess Who still produced strong albums with Winter's songwriting adding new layers. But something intangible had changed. The magic of the Cummings-Bachman chemistry, lightning in a bottle, was gone. What remained was a talented band holding on to something that couldn't be fully rebuilt. Through the early 70s, the lineup became a revolving door. Musical direction shifted toward jazz rock experiments and more polished sounds, a move that divided fans. The hits slowed, even though the band was still respected, and by 1975, the exhaustion caught up with them. Burton Cummings, the last original creative pillar, dissolved the band entirely. The Guess Who name sat unclaimed, silent, vulnerable, and that vulnerability would set the stage for one of the strangest identity battles in rock history. The fake Guess Who era and the legal battles. When the Guess Who officially dissolved in 1975, most fans assumed the story had simply ended. Burton Cummings went solo, Randy Bachman built a second career with Bachman-Turner Overdrive, and the rest of the members drifted into other projects. No one imagined that the name itself, the banner they once flew under so proudly, would become the center of a decades-long storm. The mistake was simple but devastating. No one secured the trademark. For a band that had sold millions of records and dominated charts on 2 continents, it was a blind spot that would cost them their legacy. In 1986, more than a decade after the breakup, original bassist Jim Cale made a move that changed everything. While the rest of the band was focused on their own careers, Cale quietly registered the Guess Who as a U.S. trademark, legally giving him sole ownership of the name. He didn't record new hits with the band. He didn't sing the classics, but on paper, he owned it, and he used that power fully. Cale assembled new touring lineups, often with no Burton Cummings and no Randy Bachman, the 2 men responsible for nearly every major hit. Drummer Gary Peterson joined him at times, but the faces on stage rarely matched the legacy. Still, the posters said, "The Guess Who." The venues said, "The Guess Who." And most fans didn't know the difference until they walked into concerts expecting the iconic voice of Cummings, and got strangers instead. Tension exploded. In interview after interview, Cummings and Bachman blasted the touring act as a fake Guess Who, a tribute band hiding behind a legal loophole, even calling them Cale's clones. They weren't angry about nostalgia, they were angry that people were being misled. But the law didn't care about emotions, it cared about paperwork, and Cale had the paperwork. Reunion attempts collapsed because of the trademark issue. The Cale-led Guess Who continued touring through the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, releasing albums that critics largely dismissed. Meanwhile, the original members watched their legacy being reshaped without their voices, their sound, or their permission. What had once been a band became a battlefield, and the conflict was only just beginning. The public war explodes. By the 2000s, the tension surrounding the Guess Who wasn't just an internal issue, it had become a public spectacle. Fans were confused, critics were outspoken, and Burton Cummings and Randy Bachman had reached their breaking point. What had quietly simmered for decades erupted into a very loud and very public war over the band's identity. For years, the KO-led lineup toured under the name, performing the hits that Cummings had written and sung, despite him having nothing to do with the performances. To most people buying tickets, the Guess Who meant the iconic voice from American Woman, These Eyes, and No Time. But what they got instead was a version of the band with zero connection to the original sound aside from Cale's legal claim. Cummings began calling the act a fraud, and Bachman insisted fans were being duped. Their frustration wasn't rooted in ego, it was rooted in the reality that people were paying for the legacy but not receiving it. Then things escalated. In 2023, after years of interviews, warnings, and private disputes, Cummings and Bachman launched a massive false advertising lawsuit against the Cale Peterson lineup. They claimed the band was using misleading posters, promotional photos, and even snippets of original recordings to trick audiences into believing the classic voices would be on stage. In their filing, they accused the touring act of appropriating a legacy they did not build, and sought millions in damages. Suddenly, this wasn't just a fan debate, it was national news. Music publications covered the feud, legal analysts weighed in, and longtime fans took sides. Some defended Cale's legal right to the name. Others argued that the soul of the Guess Who always lived in Bachman and Cummings. The battle intensified again in early 2024, when Burton Cummings made a decisive move. He pulled performance rights to several of the songs he wrote. Without legal permission to play the hits, the Cale-led version was forced to strip iconic tracks like These Eyes and No Time out of their set lists. For a touring band built on nostalgia, it was a near-fatal blow. And then came the twist no one expected. In September 2024, after months of negotiation, a surprise settlement was announced, one that would flip the entire story upside down. The men who created the legacy were finally about to reclaim their name. The legacy. Question: who really is the Guess Who? The announcement of the 2024 settlement hit the music world like a shockwave. After nearly 4 decades of confusion, arguments, lawsuits, and competing versions of the same band, Burton Cummings and Randy Bachman finally regained control of the Guess Who name. It wasn't just a legal win, it was an emotional one. For years, they had watched strangers tour under their banner, watched their songs performed by voices that weren't theirs, and watched fans walk away disappointed and misled. Now, for the first time since the mid-1970s, the two men who built the legacy finally had the banner back in their hands. But the fight left scars. Even after the settlement, the lingering question remained: who truly defines a band? Is it the people who own the trademark, or the voices and songwriters who shape the sound? For the Guess Who, this question became more than an abstract debate. It became the lens through which younger generations discovered them. New fans, discovering the band on streaming platforms, had no idea why there were 2 versions of the Guess Who touring for so long. They didn't understand why videos showed one lineup on stage while the original voices appeared on album covers. Many thought there were multiple eras, like you'd see with Fleetwood Mac or Chicago, until they dug deeper and realized the truth. Music historians weighed in too. They pointed out that Cummings' vocals were so essential to the band's identity that hearing anyone else sing These Eyes or Laughing felt like watching someone else impersonate Freddie Mercury or Steve Perry. The voice was the brand, and yet, for years, the legal ownership had been in someone else's hands. The settlement fixed that, but it didn't erase the decades of confusion. Still, something powerful began to happen. With Bachman and Cummings planning new shows under the original name, fans felt the sense of closure they'd been missing. Suddenly, the story of the Guess Who wasn't just about conflict. It was about reclamation, about 2 men fighting to restore the truth of their legacy. And yet, even with the name finally back where it belonged, one question lingered. After everything that happened, what would the Guess Who look like moving forward? The rise, the fall, and the mystery of their future. With the trademark finally back in their hands, Burton Cummings and Randy Bachman stood at a crossroads no one could have predicted decades earlier. For years, the legacy of the Guess Who felt fractured, split between the classic recordings that defined an era and the touring lineup that used the name without the original voices. But 2024 changed everything. It wasn't just a legal correction, it was the restoration of a story that had been drifting for far too long. Even now, their music refuses to fade. American Woman, These Eyes, No Time, and so many others live on through classic rock radio, movie soundtracks, and streaming playlists. Younger fans stumble into their catalog and are shocked to discover these tracks came from a Canadian band that once rivaled the biggest acts of the 70s. Their influence is undeniable, echoed in rock, alternative, and even the grunge bands that cited them as early inspirations. But with the name back under their control, the next question feels heavier than ever. What comes next? Bachman and Cummings, both decades older now, still possess the fire that fueled their early hits. They've announced new performances under the Guess Who banner, stirring hope of a final chapter worthy of their legacy. But time is a ruthless partner. Fans wonder if there will be new music, a celebratory tour, or simply one last reunion to close the book the right way. After all the battles, betrayals, and courtroom fights, the band that once soared to unimaginable heights now stands on the edge of something more personal, a chance to reclaim not just a name, but a story. The Guess Who's story isn't just a rise and fall, it's a reminder that a band's greatest battles don't always happen on stage. They fought the charts, they fought each other, and eventually, they fought for the right to reclaim their own name. After decades of confusion and conflict, the legacy finally sits with the voices who built it. If you enjoyed diving into the untold truth behind this legendary band, make sure you hit subscribe and join us here on Backstage Melody. There's a whole world of hidden stories, forgotten rivalries, and behind-the-scenes moments waiting for you. Don't miss what's coming next.